the 12th of June, 1943, somewhere over the western Mediterranean, mid-morning. A lone American fighter is running a special transfer flight from Gibraltar toward Malta, a routine ferry leg ahead of the invasion the Allies are quietly building toward that summer. It is a Lockheed P-38G Lightning, twin-boomed, twin-engined, unlike anything else flying on either side of this war, and its pilot is relying on a magnetic compass that has, without his knowledge, drifted some 30 degrees off true. He holds what he believes is his course. The sea beneath him does not match the chart in his lap, but the weather is hazy, the fuel is finite, and eventually a runway appears below through the haze, and he takes it, gratefully, believing it to be Allied Malta. June 1943 was a month of careful, deliberate build-up in this theater, weeks before the Allied invasion of Sicily that would open the following month. And ferry and reconnaissance flights of exactly this kind, moving aircraft and information between Gibraltar, North Africa, and forward bases toward Malta, were routine and largely unremarkable, which is precisely why nobody on either side expected one of them to end with an intact American interceptor parked on an Italian runway. It is not Malta. It is Capoterra, near Cagliari, on the Italian island of Sardinia, an airfield of the Regia Aeronautica, and the American pilot who lands there, largely by mistake and largely intact, has just handed one of the strangest and most closely watched fighter designs in the United States Army Air Forces to the wrong side of the war. His name does not survive in the record this channel has been able to access. Unlike the last two captured American fighters this channel has told you about, this one begins with an absence, a pilot known only by the compass error that betrayed him. Pause on that sentence. A 30-degree compass error, over open water, handed an intact example of the aircraft American planners had built specifically to fly higher, faster, and further than anything the Axis had in the air, directly into Axis hands, before a single German test pilot had to fire a shot or risk a dogfight to get one. What happened to that airplane over the following 16 months is a story about two different kinds of verdict, one written in a test report at a quiet lake in Mecklenburg, the other shouted over a radio by German fighter pilots who met the type in the air and did not always agree with each other about what they had just fought. This is not a story about one navigation error over the Mediterranean. This is the story of a P-38G Lightning that fell into Axis hands whole, of the Italian and German pilots who flew it, and of what German fighter pilots on three different fronts concluded, sometimes admiringly and sometimes contemptuously, about the strangest-looking American fighter of the war. Part 1. To understand why this aircraft confused German pilots before they had even measured it, you have to understand what the Lightning looked like next to everything else in the sky in 1943. Every other first-line fighter on either side, the Spitfire, the Bf-109, the Mustang, the Focke-Wulf 190, followed the same basic recipe: one engine, one propeller, one fuselage with the pilot sitting more or less in the middle of it. The Lightning did none of that. It was built around two engines housed in slender booms that ran the full length of the airplane, each ending in a tail boom joined by a single horizontal stabilizer, with the pilot sitting alone in a short central nacelle that carried no engine at all, only cannon, machine guns, and a cockpit. Seen head-on or from below, it did not read as a single airplane, so much as two airplanes that had agreed to share a wing. A nickname is often attached to it in retellings today: Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, supposedly coined by the German pilots who feared it most. Serious post-war research into period German documents has not been able to confirm the phrase actually circulated among Luftwaffe pilots at the time, and this channel would rather flag that uncertainty than repeat a nickname simply because it makes for a better line. What is well documented is that the silhouette itself, twin-boom, twin-engine, was unlike anything German pilots had trained to recognize, and that alone shaped first impressions before a single Lightning had been flown by German hands. German fighter pilots in the Mediterranean theater had already been meeting the type in the air for the better part of a year by the time this particular example landed at Capoterra. The Lightning had arrived over North Africa alongside the Operation Torch landings in November 1942, flying long-range escort and fighter-bomber missions in numbers substantial enough that German fighter wings based in Tunisia had ample opportunity to form opinions about it well before any of them had one to climb into and measure for themselves. Part 2. The aircraft German and Italian pilots were about to fly had begun in 1937 as an answer to a United States Army Air Corps requirement for an interceptor that could reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes and sustain 360 miles an hour, numbers that ruled out a conventional single-engine layout with the technology available at the time. Lockheed's chief engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson, still in his 20s, proposed the twin-boom configuration specifically to solve that requirement, mounting two Allison V1710 engines, each fitted with its own turbo-supercharger and each turning its propeller in the opposite direction from its twin, so that the torque from one engine canceled the torque from the other rather than fighting the pilot for control. The central nacelle, freed from having to hold an engine, instead held four 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, firing straight down the airplane's centerline rather than converging from the wings the way British and German fighters had to, which meant a Lightning pilot did not need to worry about the range at which his guns crossed paths, only about the range at which they hit. That same twin-engine layout that gave the Lightning its altitude performance and its concentrated firepower also gave it, in 1941 and 1942, a genuinely dangerous flaw that Lockheed itself did not fully understand at first. In a high-speed dive from altitude, air flowing over the wing began at a certain speed to reach the local speed of sound before the rest of the airplane did, a phenomenon called compressibility, and the result was a violent nose-down tuck that could overpower the pilot's ability to pull out. A Lockheed test pilot named Ralph Verdon was killed testing exactly this problem in November of 1941, and it took Lockheed and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics until 1943 to work out a fix. A set of dive recovery flaps fitted under the wing that restored elevator authority at high Mach numbers, arriving in quantity only on the P-38J model late that year. It is worth pausing on how early this was. Lockheed engineers and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics were wrestling seriously with compressibility, the leading edge of what would later be popularized as the sound barrier problem, years before Chuck Yeager's much more famous supersonic flight in 1947. And they were doing it not in a specially built research rocket plane, but in a production fighter already being flown by ordinary squadron pilots who had no idea their airplane could kill them this particular way until it started doing so. The same twin-engine layout cut the other way as well, in the pilot's favor rather than against him. A single-engine fighter that took a serious hit over enemy territory generally gave its pilot one option: come down somewhere and hope. A Lightning pilot who lost an engine to flak or a lucky burst of fire still had a second one: off-center thrust to manage and a genuinely demanding workload. 2 throttles, 2 sets of supercharger controls, 2 sets of engine instruments to scan in the middle of a fight, but a real chance of nursing a crippled airplane home rather than abandoning it over the sea or the desert. The counter-rotating propellers that canceled out torque also made the Lightning an unusually stable gun platform at the moment of firing, which mattered more than raw maneuverability once a pilot had actually got his sights on target, since 4 machine guns and a cannon firing straight down the center line rewarded a steady aim far more than a tight turn. The P-38G that landed at Capoterra in June 1943, in other words, was flying without that fix, an airplane whose single most dangerous quirk, once German and Italian pilots learned about it, would become one of the very few tactical advantages available against it. Part 3. Once down at Capoterra, the Lightning did not stay Italian property, in the sense of belonging to a museum piece. The Regia Aeronautica's chief test pilot, Colonnello Angelo Tondi, flew the captured G model to Guidonia, Italy's main aviation test center outside Rome, for a full evaluation, and Italy, being short of genuinely modern fighter types by the summer of 1943, the aircraft was not simply measured, it was put to work. On the 11th of August, 1943, Tondi took the captured Lightning up to intercept a formation of roughly 50 American heavy bombers returning from a raid on Terni in Umbria, and claimed a kill, though surviving accounts differ on whether the bomber he brought down was a B-17 or a B-24, a detail this channel will not resolve by simply picking whichever version sounds more dramatic. Ground crews also discovered a more mundane problem. Italian aviation fuel proved corrosive to the Lightning's fuel tank sealant. a small industrial mismatch between two supposedly compatible fuel systems that quietly limited how much use Italy could actually get out of its captured prize. Guidonia itself was Italy's answer to Rechlin, a purpose-built aviation research center outside Rome where the Regia Aeronautica tested new domestic designs and, increasingly as the war went on, captured Allied ones. Tondi was not a junior officer indulging a curiosity. As the service's chief test pilot, he was among the small handful of men in the entire Italian Air Force qualified to draw a formal, credible comparison between a brand new American interceptor and the aircraft Italy was still sending into combat. And his willingness to fly the Lightning operationally against a live formation of American bombers, rather than simply write up its handling qualities on paper, says as much about Italy's fighter shortage by the summer of 1943 as it does about his own nerve. Then, on the 8th of September 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, and within days, German forces executed Operation Achse, disarming their former ally and seizing Italian airfields, aircraft, and equipment across the peninsula, rather than risk any of it falling to the advancing Allies. The captured Lightning, sitting on an Italian test field, became German property in exactly the way it had become Italian property 3 months earlier. Not through combat, but through the simple fact of being on the wrong side of a line when the front moved. Part 4. Repainted and given the Luftwaffe test code T9+XB, the Lightning was flown to Rechlin, the same lakeside test center in Mecklenburg this channel has already described, taking apart a captured Spitfire, a captured Thunderbolt, and a captured Mustang. Ground crews there painted its undersides and wingtips the same pale yellow used on all captured Allied types at Rechlin, not for camouflage, but for the opposite reason, so that German anti-aircraft gunners in the area would recognize an unmistakably Allied silhouette and hold their fire rather than shoot down their own test aircraft by mistake. This channel has now described that same pale yellow paint scheme on a captured Spitfire, a captured Thunderbolt, and a captured Mustang, and the repetition is not an accident of storytelling. It was standard Luftwaffe practice across every one of these aircraft, a small, consistent piece of institutional housekeeping that shows up again and again in the paperwork, regardless of which enemy air force the airframe underneath it had originally belonged to. The same captured types touring with Zirkus Rosarius were also used, beyond pilot familiarization, to train German anti-aircraft gunners and airfield spotters in silhouette recognition, since a flak battery that could tell a Lightning from a Messerschmitt at a glance was a flak battery far less likely to shoot at the wrong aircraft, friend or captured curiosity, in the confusion of an actual raid. By late 1943, the Lightning had been added to the stable of Zirkus Rosarius, the traveling unit under Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius that toured captured Allied fighters to frontline Luftwaffe wings. And it appeared in an air show staged at Rechlin itself before the year was out. A genuinely strange fixture. An American interceptor wearing German crosses, performed for German pilots so they could see with their own eyes exactly what shape they were meant to be shooting at. The technical verdict that emerged from Rechlin's handling of the type was, in its broad strokes, unsurprising to anyone who had followed this channel's earlier captured aircraft stories. German evaluators noted real respect for the type's climb rate and high-altitude performance, the direct product of those twin turbo superchargers, and for the accuracy advantage of concentrated, non-converging nose armament. They also flagged, as American test pilots already knew from hard experience, the compressibility problem in a steep, high-speed dive, an airplane that could climb away from trouble more easily than it could dive away from it. The record does not preserve a single named Rechlin test pilot's full written report on this particular airframe, the way it preserves Hans Werner Lerche's accounts of the Thunderbolt and the Mustang. Lerche's own published memoir, in fact, does not include a chapter on the Lightning at all, and this channel would rather say so plainly than invent a verdict and attach a real name to it. What survives instead is a wider, messier, and in some ways more honest picture, assembled from the frontline pilots who actually met the type in combat rather than on a test range. Part 5. That wider picture was genuinely divided, and the division itself is the story. Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77 over North Africa, judged that his unit's aging Bf-109s were only marginally faster than the Lightning, and that a dogfight against one was, in his own word, daunting. Herbert Kaiser, who would finish the war with 68 victories, shot down his first Lightning in January 1943, and afterward described the type as a formidable opponent, faster and more maneuverable, in his judgment, than the Bf 109 G6 he was flying at the time. Johann Pichler, another high-scoring ace, singled out its rate of climb in 1943 as markedly superior to the Messerschmitts. Set against that, Kurt Bühligen, the third highest-scoring German pilot on the Western Front, with 112 victories, recalled simply that the Lightning, like the American B-24 bomber, burned easily once you got hits into it, a plain, unglamorous observation that cuts directly against any idea that German pilots regarded the type with uncomplicated dread. These were not isolated impressions formed in a single afternoon. Between the Tunisian campaign in the winter of 1942 and 1943, the Sicilian invasion that summer, and the long, grinding retreat up the Italian peninsula that followed, German fighter wings on this front met American Lightnings on an almost weekly basis, escorting bombers, strafing airfields, and flying reconnaissance. Which is exactly why their verdicts carry more weight than a single test flight at Rechlin ever could. They were not describing an unfamiliar curiosity. They were describing an opponent they had already been fighting, repeatedly, for the better part of a year. And Franz Stiegler, a pilot whose own post-war reputation would come to rest on an act of mercy rather than a kill tally, described the tactical rule his unit lived by against the type: never engage a Lightning head-on. That was suicide given its concentrated nose armament, and instead force the fight into a flick roll and a dive. Because the Lightning was slow through the first 10 degrees of roll, and, whatever its reputation, not as fast in a dive as a 109 that knew how to use gravity. Part 6. Read together, these accounts do not add up to a single, tidy verdict. And that is itself the honest answer to what the Lightning meant to the pilots who had to fly against it. It was not simply respected, and it was not simply dismissed. It outclimbed the best German fighters at altitude and carried firepower concentrated enough to end a fight in a single accurate burst. And it was also large enough to be seen from a long way off, vulnerable enough to burn under sustained fire, and slow enough through the first moments of a hard roll that a German pilot who kept his nerve and knew the airplane's one real limitation could, with the right entry, turn what looked like a losing fight into a survivable one. That is a more complicated thing to put in a single sentence than either the Luftwaffe feared it or the Luftwaffe found its weakness. And it is also, on the full weight of the record, the more accurate one. This is where the Lightning story departs from the pattern this channel's other captured aircraft episodes have followed. The Spitfire produced one honest report that was filed and ignored. The Thunderbolt produced one honest report that was acted on and taught to frontline units. The Mustang produced one honest report that was correct, and still changed nothing about the outcome. The Lightning never produced a single report at all, not in the way those other aircraft did, because the men best qualified to judge it were not sitting at a test center reading dials. They were flying against it, in earnest, on 3 different fronts, and they never fully agreed with each other about what they had learned. Sometimes the most honest verdict a war produces is not a clean one. The pilot who handed Italy and then Germany an intact example of all of this by way of a bad compass reading in June 1943 is, as far as this channel's research has been able to establish, unnamed in the surviving accounts, a gap this channel would rather leave open than fill with invention. What is recorded of the airframe itself ends almost as abruptly as it began. Luftwaffe records list it condemned as missing, non-combat, on the 20th of October 1943. Barely 5 weeks after Operation Achse had made it German property, and only weeks after its appearance at the Rechlin Air Show. With no further explanation preserved in the paperwork this channel has been able to access. An airplane that had been Italian, then German, that had shot down an American bomber under one flag, and toured German airfields to teach pilots how to shoot down its own kind under another, disappears from the record without ceremony, the way a great many aircraft on both sides of this war eventually did. Kelly Johnson, the young engineer who had drawn the twin-boom layout to answer a 1937 interceptor requirement, went on from the Lightning to lead Lockheed's Skunk Works, and to design, among other things, the high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that would spend the following Cold War doing to Soviet radar operators roughly what the Lightning's altitude performance had once done to German pilots over the Mediterranean, staying just out of reach of whatever was sent up to catch it. Johnson would spend the rest of his career solving, again and again, some version of the same problem the Lightning had first handed him: how to keep an airplane ahead of whatever the other side could put in the air against it. First with the U-2 in the 1950s, and then with the SR-71 Blackbird in the 1960s, an airplane that answered the compressibility problem that had killed Ralph Verdon by simply being built to cruise faster than sound rather than dive into it by accident. Angelo Tondi continued flying and testing for Italy's Air Force through the chaotic final phase of the war on the peninsula. Franz Stiegler survived the war, emigrated to Canada afterward, and became known decades later, far more than for any tally of Lightnings or anything else he shot down, for an encounter over Germany in December 1943, in which he chose to escort a crippled American bomber safely out of German airspace rather than finish it off. A story that reached a wide audience only when the American pilot he spared tracked him down some 40 years later. That pilot, Charlie Brown, and Stigler himself became friends in their old age, corresponded for years, and died within months of each other in 2008. A small postscript that has nothing directly to do with the Lightning, and everything to do with the same theme running through every captured aircraft this channel has told you about: that the men doing the actual fighting were frequently more honest, and occasionally more merciful, than the systems and propaganda they served under. Kurt Buligan survived the war as one of the most decorated fighter pilots Germany produced on the Western Front. Herbert Kaiser and Johannes Steinhoff both survived as well, Steinhoff going on to a long post-war career in the rebuilt West German Air Force. The men who formed a verdict on this strange, twin-boomed American fighter mostly lived long enough to keep refining it, which is more than can be said for the pilot who first put it, unnamed and by mistake, into their hands. On the American side of the same argument, a young lieutenant named Richard Bong was, at almost exactly this time, beginning to turn the Lightning's climb rate and concentrated firepower, the same qualities Steinhoff, Kaiser, and Pickler had already respected from the other cockpit, into a personal score that would eventually reach 40 confirmed victories in the Pacific, the highest total of any American pilot of the war, and a Medal of Honor. Whatever German pilots could not fully agree on about the Lightning, Bong settled for the record simply by flying it better, for longer, against more different opponents than anyone else the United States sent aloft in it. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More captured aircraft, more divided verdicts, more machines that told German pilots something true and uncomfortable about the war they were fighting, whether that truth arrived as respect, as contempt, or, as it did this time, as both at once from men who had actually been up there and fought it. A compass 30 degrees off course. 2 engines instead of 1. A verdict that never quite agreed with itself, because the airplane never quite gave anyone a single, simple reason to.